The dogs come at 5, before the heat, before the street outside the bakery has decided what kind of day it's going to be, arriving in the same loose, familiar order every single morning, as though some quiet, unspoken hierarchy among them has already settled these matters long before I ever step outside. This is the story of a man who once ran 3 restaurants in France, who lost nearly everything he'd built to a woman who'd done exactly this before, twice, and who now measures his entire remaining life in rice, scraps, and 9 stray dogs who have no idea, and never will, that he used to be somebody. I owned 3 restaurants in Lyon, across a working life that spanned nearly 4 decades, starting with a single small bistro I opened at 29, with money borrowed from my own father, a man who never once believed the venture would survive its first hard winter, and lived, grudgingly, long enough to admit he'd been wrong, coming to eat there quietly, alone, once a month for the rest of his life, without ever once telling me directly how proud he actually was. I built that first place into something genuinely respected across the city, added a second establishment in my 40s, a third in my 50s, each one carrying its own particular identity, its own regulars, its own small, hard-won reputation among people who took their food seriously, in a city that has never once taken food lightly, a city where a poorly reduced sauce could genuinely end a young chef's reputation before it had properly begun. I sold all 3 at 68, a decision that took me nearly 2 years to fully commit to, walking away with 340,000 euros after taxes, a figure that felt, at the time, like the honest, well-earned conclusion to a life spent standing on my feet 12 hours a day for other people's pleasure. 40 years of burns and cuts, and the specific, particular exhaustion of a trade that never once lets a man sit down properly during service, my own accountant assuring me, repeatedly, that the sum was more than sufficient to carry me comfortably through whatever years remained. My wife Colette died of a heart attack 6 years before I sold the restaurants. Sudden, no warning at all after 41 years of marriage that had somehow survived the particular strain of building a business empire, however modest, alongside raising 2 daughters who'd both grown into genuinely accomplished women, despite, rather than because of, how little time I'd actually had for them across those working decades. Evenings and weekends, consumed almost entirely by service, birthdays celebrated in the restaurant's own dining room after closing, because there was simply nowhere else the family could reliably gather together, Colette setting a small table in the corner once the last customers had gone, the girls falling asleep some years before the cake was even properly cut, a pattern of childhood I've had considerable time since to feel genuinely conflicted about. Our daughters, Sylvie and Marguerite, both settled with their own families near Lyon, called regularly, dutiful and warm, Sylvie working as a schoolteacher not far from where she'd grown up, Marguerite having moved slightly further south for her own husband's career, and I found myself, in the 2 years between selling the restaurants and actually leaving France, restless in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, a man whose entire identity had been organized around kitchens and service and the specific, satisfying chaos of a Saturday evening rush, suddenly facing an unstructured retirement with no clear shape at all, mornings that used to begin with market visits and menu planning, now stretching out empty and directionless, with nothing particular demanding my attention. I visited the Philippines for the first time at 70, a trip suggested by an old supplier I'd worked with for decades, who'd retired to Cebu a few years earlier and kept sending photographs that made the gray, familiar comfort of Lyon look considerably less appealing by comparison. Photographs of beaches and markets, and a particular quality of light that seemed, somehow, entirely absent from the streets I'd walked my whole life. I extended that first visit twice, eventually making my way to Dumaguete, a smaller, quieter city than Cebu that appealed to me immediately, something in its unhurried pace reminding me, oddly, of the small provincial towns outside Lyon I'd grown up visiting as a boy, before the ambition of a restaurant career had ever entered my thinking, before I'd understood that a kitchen could consume an entire life if you let it. I met Vangie at a small cafe near the Dumaguete waterfront during my 3rd extended visit, 38 years old, working there as a manager, and I want to be honest that what drew me to her wasn't primarily romantic in the conventional sense. not at first. It was professional admiration, the specific, immediate recognition of genuine talent that I'd spent an entire career learning to identify in staff. The particular way she moved through that small cafe, anticipating a table's needs before they'd voice them. Managing a difficult customer with a warmth that never once curdled into anything false. Resolving a kitchen delay with a calm, practical grace that had the whole dining room settled again within minutes. The exact instinct I'd spent decades trying, mostly unsuccessfully, to train into staff who'd never quite possessed it naturally. I remember thinking, watching her work that first afternoon, sitting alone with a coffee I'd ordered simply as an excuse to linger, that I hadn't seen genuine, unteachable front-of-house talent like that since my own early years in Lyon. Watching a young waitress named Colette move through my very first bistro with exactly the same natural, effortless grace. A resemblance I noted at the time with real, uncomplicated affection rather than any suspicion it might carry a weight I hadn't yet considered. Telling myself, rather sentimentally for a man of 70, that perhaps I'd simply developed an eye for a particular kind of person across an entire working life spent hiring and observing staff. We began seeing each other regularly over the following months, and the relationship deepened alongside a specific, shared professional excitement that I hadn't expected to feel again at 71. The two of us talking late into countless evenings about the kind of restaurant we might build together. A genuine, considered fusion of French technique and local ingredients that excited me in a way I hadn't been excited by anything in years. Sketching menu ideas on paper napkins across dozens of dinners. Arguing cheerfully over whether a local fish could properly stand in for the sole I'd normally have insisted on. I want to be clear that I entered this partnership with real professional caution, not the naive enthusiasm of a lonely old man simply grateful for company. I'd spent 39 years learning to evaluate talent, to distinguish genuine ability from performance, and Vangie's ability, whatever else eventually turned out to be true about her, was never in question. That specific, genuine talent is, I've come to understand, precisely what made everything that followed possible. We opened the restaurant roughly a year after we met, a modest but genuinely well-designed place near the waterfront that I named, with what I understand now as a certain naive sentimentality, le petit retour, the small return, meaning to suggest both a return to my own roots as a young restaurateur and a return, more personally, to a life I'd thought was finished. The sign itself hand-painted by a local artist Vangie recommended. The whole opening week genuinely festive, filled with a hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel this completely since long before Colette's death. Vangie handled the local logistics, the lease negotiations, the supplier relationships, the various permits and licenses a foreigner navigating an unfamiliar bureaucracy simply couldn't manage as efficiently alone. An arrangement that felt, at the time, like the natural and sensible division of labor between two genuine partners, rather than anything worth examining more closely. I want to explain, with as much precision as I can manage, exactly how the actual mechanics of what happened worked, because I think the specifics matter considerably more than the general shape of the story. The lease on the restaurant property went into Vangie's name entirely. A structure, she explained, reasonably enough at the time, as standard practice given the foreign ownership restrictions I'd already read about extensively before ever committing serious money to the venture. A restriction I'd independently verified myself through an entirely legitimate local lawyer before ever agreeing to the arrangement. A different lawyer than Ferdinand, a man whose name I no longer entirely trust having relied on, which is precisely why I never once thought to question the structure further once that initial verification came back clean. The suppliers we used, produce, meat, the specific imported ingredients I insisted on for certain dishes, turned out, I discovered only much later, to be run predominantly by Vangie's own extended family, cousins and in-laws, whose invoices I never once thought to independently verify against market rates, trusting instead the same professional instinct that had once told me, correctly, that she was a genuinely gifted manager, a trust I extended without ever once separating her genuine talent in the dining room from her equally genuine talent for structuring a business in her own favor behind it. The renovation of the space, which came to roughly €90,000 across several months of work, included invoices for materials and labor that I later understood to have been, at least partially, imagined, work billed that was never actually completed, or completed at a fraction of the invoiced cost. A discovery I only made after the entire relationship had already collapsed, and I finally sat down, far too late, with the accumulated paperwork spread across a table, trying to reconstruct exactly where €340,000 had actually gone, cross-referencing dates and figures with the same grim, methodical thoroughness I'd once applied to reconciling a difficult month's accounts, an exercise that took the better part of 3 full weeks and ultimately produced a picture considerably more complete and considerably more painful than I'd expected when I first sat down at that table, certain I could finish the task in a single afternoon. The restaurant itself operated for just under 2 years, and I want to be honest that for most of that stretch, it felt, from the inside, like a genuine success. Tables consistently full most evenings. A small but growing reputation among both local diners and the modest expat community, word spreading in the particular. Organic way it always used to spread back in Lyon. One satisfied table recommending us to the next. Real, unmistakable joy in standing at the pass again, tasting sauces, correcting a plate's presentation, doing the only work I'd ever truly known how to do, my hands remembering, almost immediately, rhythms I'd assumed retirement had already begun to erase. I don't believe, even now, sitting with all of this many years later, that the restaurant itself was ever a fiction. It was genuinely real, genuinely functioning, genuinely for a while, exactly the thing I'd traveled across the world hoping to build one last time. What I didn't understand, across that entire 2-year stretch, was the actual shape of the financial structure running beneath the restaurant's visible success. The liquor license, essential to any restaurant's profitability in the evenings, had been quietly transferred, over the course of several administrative steps I never once fully understood at the time, into a separate entity, controlled entirely by Vangie, a transfer she explained. When I finally asked about it directly near the very end, as a temporary measure related to some licensing complication I never quite got a clear account of, an explanation delivered with just enough plausible bureaucratic detail that I let the matter drop rather than pressing further, a decision I've regretted many times since. The restaurant's actual profits, I eventually understood, had been flowing for months through channels I had no visibility into at all, structured with a patience and a precision that, I've since had to admit, reflected genuine skill rather than any hasty, opportunistic grab. The collapse, when it finally came, arrived through an old friend from the local expat community, a retired Australian named Bruce, who'd been drinking at my restaurant most evenings for the better part of a year, and who finally, one quiet Tuesday evening, after most of the other guests had gone, sat down across from me at the bar, with an expression that told me, before he'd said a single word, that whatever he was about to say had been weighing on him considerably longer than that single evening, and told me something he'd apparently been carrying for months, uncertain how or whether to share it. He told me, plainly, that Vangie had run essentially this exact structure before, twice, with 2 other foreign men, both restaurant ventures, both ending in remarkably similar circumstances, the foreign partner eventually discovering that the actual legal and financial architecture of the business had never once genuinely included him, despite years of his own capital and labor building it. I want to describe the specific quality of hearing that information, because it landed differently than I expected. Sitting there at my own bar in my own restaurant, listening to a friend deliver news that would eventually cost me everything I'd built. It wasn't disbelief exactly. Some part of me, I think, had already been quietly assembling the same suspicion across recent months, watching cash flow patterns I couldn't quite reconcile, noticing a growing, unexplained distance in Vangie's own manner that I'd attributed, generously, to the ordinary stress of running a demanding business rather than anything more deliberate. Bruce's information simply gave that quiet, half-formed suspicion an actual shape, a history, a pattern I could no longer explain away as simple coincidence or my own professional paranoia. I confronted Vangie directly the following week, laying out everything Bruce had told me alongside my own accumulated financial questions: the lease, the supplier invoices, the liquor license transfer, sitting across from her in the same dining room where we'd once sketched menu ideas on paper napkins, with such easy, genuine excitement, expecting, I suppose, either a genuine explanation or a dramatic confrontation. What I got instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more devastating. She didn't deny the history Bruce had described. She simply looked at me, tired in a way I hadn't seen from her before, the specific tiredness of someone finally setting down a performance she'd been maintaining for a very long time, her shoulders dropping slightly, in a way I'd never once witnessed across our entire 2 years together, and said, "Albert, the restaurant is real. The food is real. What you're asking about is just how a woman here survives, when the men always eventually leave anyway, with or without an explanation." I asked her whether she'd ever, even once across our entire time together, genuinely loved any part of what we'd built together, and she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I don't know anymore if I know the difference between loving something and needing it to work. Maybe for me, those became the same thing a long time ago." The end, once it actually arrived, moved with a speed that still surprises me even now. Within 3 weeks of that conversation, Vangie had transferred her remaining stake in whatever structure actually controlled the business. The restaurant's lease reverted entirely to her separate corporate entity, and I found myself, at 73 years old, standing outside a restaurant I'd built with my own hands and my own life savings, legally entitled to almost nothing of it at all, looking through the front window one final evening at a dining room I'd personally overseen the design of, tables I'd chosen, a pass I'd stood behind for 2 of the fullest, most genuinely happy years of my entire retirement. I retained a local lawyer, a careful, patient man named Ferdinand Cruz, who reviewed the entire tangle of paperwork across several difficult meetings, spreading contracts and invoices across his own desk, with the particular grim thoroughness of a man who'd clearly seen versions of this exact situation many times before, occasionally pausing to ask me a question that made clear, without his ever saying so directly, exactly how familiar this particular pattern already was to him professionally, and told me, in the end, what I'd already begun to understand myself, that pursuing meaningful legal recourse would cost more, in time and money, than I had any realistic hope of recovering, and that the structure itself had been built with enough legal sophistication that a clean, decisive victory was genuinely unlikely regardless of how much I spent trying. I want to explain something about why I never told my daughters the actual truth of what happened, because I think it's the single detail of this entire story I find hardest to defend even to myself, turning it over across many long, quiet evenings since. French pride, I've come to understand, is a specific and stubborn thing, particularly in a man of my generation who spent an entire career being the person other people relied upon, the proprietor, the patron, the man whose judgment other people trusted without question, whose signature on a lease or a contract was itself treated as a kind of guarantee across 4 decades of business dealings. I could not, in the aftermath of losing nearly everything I'd built, bring myself to call Sylvie or Marguerite and describe, plainly, exactly how their father had been deceived by a woman 39 years his junior in a country he'd chosen against both their gentle, worried advice before he ever left France, advice I remember dismissing at the time with a confidence I can no longer fully account for. I told them, instead, a carefully edited version of events, that the restaurant venture hadn't worked out as hoped, that I'd decided to simplify my life considerably, that I was, in my own words, genuinely enjoying a quieter retirement than the one I'd originally planned. I have maintained that fiction for 4 years now, across countless phone calls, carefully steering each conversation away from any question that might require a more complete answer, and I understand, with a specific clarity that doesn't make the choice feel any less necessary, that I will likely maintain it for whatever years remain to me. There was one call, roughly 18 months after everything had fully settled, that came closer than any other to breaking the fiction I'd so carefully maintained. Sylvie, my elder daughter, had apparently been doing some idle searching online, the way children do when they miss a parent more than they'd ever say out loud, and mentioned, almost in passing, that she couldn't find any current listing for Le Petit Retour, that the restaurant seemed to have simply disappeared from every directory she'd checked. I remember the specific, cold moment of having to construct, on the spot, a plausible explanation, telling her that the restaurant had indeed closed, that I'd sold my share some time ago as part of the general simplification of my life I'd already described to her, my voice remaining entirely level throughout, despite the sudden, racing thoughts behind it, delivering the lie with a steadiness that surprised even me. 40 years behind a kitchen pass, having apparently taught me something about composure under pressure that I never once expected to need for this particular, painful purpose. She was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Papa, you would tell me if something had actually gone wrong out there, wouldn't you? You know that, right?" A question delivered with just enough gentle insistence that I understood she genuinely needed the reassurance, rather than simply asking out of idle politeness. I told her, of course, that I would, and I've thought about that specific lie, delivered so smoothly and so immediately, more than almost any other single moment across these past 4 years. Understanding it as the precise instant I fully committed myself to a fiction I now understand I will likely carry to my own grave. Bruce, the same friend who eventually told me the truth about Vangie's history, has remained one of the few genuine friendships to survive intact through everything that followed, and I want to be honest that his continued presence in my life has mattered more than I probably let on to him directly, more perhaps than I've let on to anyone across these past 4 years. He stops by the bakery some mornings, sitting with me on an overturned crate while I finish distributing the last of the rice to whichever dogs have straggled in late, never once treating my current circumstances as anything requiring pity or careful management, simply continuing the same easy, unremarkable friendship we'd built across those 2 years at my restaurant's bar. I asked him, fairly directly, why he'd waited so long before finally telling me the truth about what he knew, and he was quiet for a moment before admitting, with a candor I appreciated more than any apology could have offered, that he'd genuinely worried, for a long time, that telling me might simply end our own friendship entirely, without actually saving me from anything at all, that by the time he finally spoke up, some part of him had already assumed the outcome was probably inevitable, regardless of when the truth finally arrived. I've never once held that delay against him. I understand, better now than I would have before any of this happened, exactly how difficult it is to hand someone a truth you know will cost them everything they currently believe about their own life. The wider expat community in Dumaguete knows some version of what happened to me, though I've never once offered anyone the complete, unedited account I gave Ferdinand, letting the general shape of the story circulate in whatever incomplete form it naturally settled into: a failed business venture, a partnership that didn't work out, details vague enough to satisfy ordinary curiosity without ever requiring the full, humiliating specificity I've reserved for exactly one lawyer and, now, whoever happens to be listening to this account. I've noticed, over these past 4 years, a particular kind of gentleness extended to me by other retirees in this community. Invitations to dinners I mostly decline, offers of small jobs and informal work that I suspect are extended more out of genuine care than any real business necessity. A community's own quiet way of absorbing one of its own back into some semblance of ordinary life, after a collapse everyone can see the shape of, even without ever hearing its full details. A kindness I've come to accept more gracefully, with each passing year, than I once managed in those first raw, humiliated months. I attend a small monthly gathering now, organized loosely by a handful of the longer-tenured expats, retired professionals of one kind or another, a doctor, 2 former engineers, a woman who once ran her own accounting firm back in Manchester, and I've come to value those evenings considerably more than I expected to when Bruce first invited me. A room full of people who've each, in their own particular way, had to rebuild some version of a life they once assumed was permanently settled, and who understand, without ever needing the specifics explained, exactly what that particular kind of rebuilding actually costs a person. I live now in a small room behind a bakery, owned by a kind, unassuming couple who rent it to me for a modest sum I can genuinely afford, the smell of their morning bread rising through the thin wall each day before dawn, a smell I've come to find genuinely comforting, rather than any painful reminder of the professional life I've left behind. The specific, simple honesty of a small family business, run without pretension, doing occasional consulting work for a handful of local restaurants who value an old French chef's palate, even when his own restaurant days are, by any practical measure, finished, tasting a sauce here, suggesting an adjustment to a menu there, small, occasional work that pays little but reminds me, usefully, that the knowledge in my own hands hasn't entirely gone to waste. I wake most mornings before 5, before the day's heat has decided what kind of afternoon it's going to be, and I feed the stray dogs who've gathered, over these past 4 years, into something I've come to think of, however sentimentally, as my own small remaining kitchen staff. There are 9 of them who arrive regularly enough that I've named each one, mostly after dishes from my old menus, a private, faintly absurd ritual I've never fully explained to anyone who's asked, though the bakery owners have long since stopped questioning why an elderly Frenchman stands in their alley each dawn, murmuring names in French to a small pack of Filipino street dogs. Cassoulet is the fat one, slow and dignified, taking his portion with an unhurried confidence that reminds me, oddly, of a particular sous chef I once employed for over a decade, a man who never once rushed even during the busiest service, and somehow, impossibly, was always exactly on time regardless. A quiet, methodical competence I've come to genuinely miss having around me daily since retirement began. Bouillabaisse trusts no one, hangs back at the edge of the group each morning, watching carefully before finally, cautiously, approaching, always the last to actually take food directly from my hand, even after months of the same daily ritual. Exactly the way I imagine I should have approached Vangie's own restaurant proposal all those years ago, had I possessed even a fraction of that particular dog's caution. And then there is Tarte, the youngest of the group, who trusts everyone, everything, immediately and completely, running towards strangers with the same open, undefended enthusiasm I recognize, with real discomfort, as my own younger self, the man who'd once looked at a talented young woman's easy warmth, and never once thought to ask what history might be sitting quietly underneath it, a resemblance I noticed within the first week of Tarte joining the group, and have never once been able to fully shake since. I lecture Tarte sometimes, out loud, standing in the pre-dawn quiet with a bag of rice and scraps, telling him plainly, in French, that his trust will eventually cost him, that not everyone offering him warmth is offering it honestly, gesturing occasionally the way I once gestured at a young apprentice cook, explaining exactly why a particular technique would eventually fail him if he didn't correct it now. He understands none of it, of course, simply wagging and circling and waiting for his portion with the same undiminished enthusiasm every single morning, and I've come to find something genuinely instructive in that particular failure of communication. A dog who cannot learn caution, no matter how plainly you explain the cost of trusting too readily, doing exactly what I myself did for 2 full years, despite considerably more life experience than any stray dog could ever hope to accumulate. I walked past Les Petits Retours once, roughly a year after everything ended, deliberately choosing a route that would take me past it, though I could easily have avoided the street entirely, telling myself, in the moment, that I simply needed groceries from a shop further down the same road. A small, transparent lie I told only to myself. It was operating under a new name by then, a different sign, different curtains in the windows, though the layout itself, the tables I'd chosen, the pass I'd once stood behind, remained instantly, unmistakably recognizable to me, even at a glance through the front window. The specific arrangement of the dining room, still exactly as I'd designed it, right down to the small alcove table I'd once reserved for regulars celebrating anniversaries. I stood across the street for perhaps 5 minutes, long enough to watch a waiter I didn't recognize deliver a plate to a table of tourists, long enough to feel the specific, particular ache of watching a room you built with your own hands continue existing entirely without you, before finally continuing on my way and never once walking that particular street again since. The rice and scraps cost me 60 pesos a day, purchased from the cheapest reliable source I've found, and supplemented with whatever a nearby carinderia is willing to set aside for me. Table scraps and unsold portions that would otherwise simply be discarded, a small arrangement I negotiated with the carinderia's owner, a widow named Perla, who runs the place with her 2 grown sons, and who never once asks why an old Frenchman shows up each afternoon for scraps, rather than a proper meal, though I suspect she's guessed some version of the truth by now regardless, occasionally slipping an extra portion into my bag without comment, a small kindness I've never once acknowledged directly for fear that naming it might somehow embarrass us both. I want to be honest that this modest, unglamorous daily expense has become, in a way I never once anticipated, when I still owned 3 restaurants in Lyon, the entire architecture of whatever remains of my life. My mornings now organize themselves around 9 dogs and a bag of rice, with the same structural certainty that 4 decades of restaurant service once organized themselves around a Saturday evening rush, a smaller kitchen, considerably smaller steaks, but a kitchen nonetheless, with its own regulars, its own particular rhythm, its own quiet satisfactions. I called Ferdinand, my lawyer, about a year after everything had fully settled, not for any further legal purpose, but simply because he was one of the few people in Dumaguete who knew the complete, unedited truth of what had happened, and I wanted to hear someone acknowledge it plainly, rather than continue performing the careful fiction I maintained for everyone else, a specific kind of relief in speaking to a man who required no editing, no careful management of what he was and wasn't permitted to know. He listened to me describe the dogs, the bakery room, the modest consulting work, taking it all in without a trace of pity in his voice, and said, after a moment, "Albert, I've handled a great many cases like yours over the years, and most of the men never find their way to anything resembling peace afterward. You sound, if I may say, like a man who has actually found something, even if it's considerably smaller than what he lost." I told him I thought that was probably accurate, though I wasn't certain, even then, sitting with the phone against my ear in that same small room, whether I should feel proud of that particular adaptation, or quietly ashamed of how small a life I'd apparently learned to be satisfied with. I think often, standing in that pre-dawn quiet with the dogs circling my legs, about the specific, unglamorous nature of ruin at 77, because I think it's genuinely different from how ruin is typically imagined in stories like this one. There was no single dramatic collapse, no screaming confrontation, no clean, satisfying moment of villainy exposed and justice served. It was, instead, entirely logistical, a slow, methodical shrinking of a life from 3 restaurants and a comfortable retirement down to a single rented room and a daily bag of rice, each individual reduction manageable on its own terms, even as the cumulative total represented something close to the complete unmaking of everything I'd spent a working lifetime building. A process I could describe, if pressed, almost entirely in terms of paperwork and administrative steps rather than any single dramatic scene, which is precisely what makes it so difficult to explain properly to anyone who hasn't lived through something similar themselves. What I've actually learned, feeding Tarte by hand most mornings, while he learns absolutely nothing from the experience, is that this particular kind of ruin, however devastating in its total shape, doesn't actually end a man's life the way I once assumed it would, if it ever happened to me, a fear I recall genuinely entertaining in my more comfortable years, imagining, in the abstract, that a total financial collapse at my age would surely mean something close to the end of any meaningful existence at all. You shrink your life, systematically, deliberately, until it fits whatever remains, and then, and this is the part I genuinely never expected, the part no one had ever once told me across an entire lifetime of hearing other people's misfortunes, you discover that the shrunk life still, somehow, contains mornings inside it, genuine ones, with their own small satisfactions, their own particular rhythm, their own modest but real reasons to get up before dawn and walk out into a street that doesn't yet know what kind of day it's going to be. I don't forgive Vangie, not in any complete sense, and I want to be honest that I'm not certain I ever fully will. Some particular wound simply too deep, too total, to close entirely regardless of how much time passes. A specific, private grief that surfaces at unpredictable moments, tasting a particular sauce, hearing a certain song that used to play in the restaurant's dining room during service. But I've stopped needing her to have been simply cartoonishly cruel in order for my own losses to make sense, the same way I've stopped needing myself to have been simply foolish for trusting a talent I genuinely, professionally recognized as real, a distinction that took me considerably longer to arrive at honestly than I'd like to admit. Months spent oscillating between blaming her entirely and blaming myself entirely, before finally settling into something closer to the more complicated, uncomfortable truth. I think she found, at some point early in her own working life, a genuinely effective method for surviving in circumstances I never fully understood despite 2 years of daily proximity, and applied that method to me, with a skill that, I've come to accept, deserves a certain grudging professional respect, even as it cost me nearly everything I'd built across 4 decades. The dogs don't know I was somebody, and I've come to find real, if complicated, comfort in that particular fact. Cassoulet doesn't know about the second restaurant I opened at 43. The one that finally established my reputation across the whole of Lyon. The one a food critic once described, in a review I kept clipped in my wallet for years afterward, as the finest new establishment the city had seen in a decade. A clipping I still carry, folded and soft with age, tucked into the same wallet I now use to count out 60 pesos each morning. Bouillabaisse has no idea I once cooked for a visiting government minister who called my cassoulet the finest he'd had outside his own grandmother's kitchen, a compliment I still remember with genuine, uncomplicated pride even now, one of the very few memories from that entire career I can revisit without any accompanying grief. Tarte, running toward me each morning with that same undiminished, undefended enthusiasm, doesn't know anything at all about 340,000 euros, or a liquor license quietly transferred, or 2 daughters in France who believe their father is simply enjoying a quiet, uneventful retirement, rather than counting out 60 pesos each morning for a bag of rice that constitutes, in its own small and genuine way, the last kitchen he'll ever properly run.